Hello, everyone, and welcome to our rescheduled April 1st Friday webinar. Just a few quick things before we get started. If you're on our YouTube page, the chat is just on the bottom right. Make sure to sign into a Google account, and then you can go ahead and put any questions or things that you would like to say during the webinar in that area. And everyone else, just want to introduce Dr. Christy Kraft from Kansas State University, and she'll be talking about embracing the challenges and opportunities related to spirituality, religion, and non-religious religion in campus housing.
All right, thank you, Andrew, and good morning to everyone. It's morning to you all on the West Coast. It's lunchtime here. It's my great pleasure to be with all of you this morning. Two of my favorite topics are religion and campus housing. So the opportunity to talk today is a real blessing. It's really fun for me. So just to give you an idea of how I'm going to proceed, I've got probably about 35 minutes worth of information to share. And then, as Andrew stated, feel free to jot down some questions you have, and we'll have plenty of time at the end to talk through some of those as well. So first, let me give you just a bit of background about me. I'm currently an associate professor of student affairs at Kansas State University. Before I came here, I served in several student affairs administrative roles, including as the assistant dean of students at UTEP, which is the University of Texas in El Paso, where I also had the opportunity to serve as the acting director of the Student Development Center while I was there. During my doctoral work, I worked for 4 years as a graduate hall director in this residence stadium at the University of Arizona. For anyone who's been there recently, you will know that this is an older picture of it. It looked like when I was there, but they've since done some work on it. And I started my career as an undergraduate back in 1991, so you know how old I am now, probably, at Bradley University in Peoria, Illinois, where I lived in that residence hall that's right in the middle. It's High Hall. I eventually became an RA and a desk assistant, and there's a picture of me very intimidatingly working as security staff at Bradley University. So working in the residence halls has been something that I've enjoyed, and like I said, I just have a passion for housing. While I was working in housing, I noticed and learned a lot about religion and spirituality among college students. And then after that, I started studying these issues from a scholarly perspective, and have been studying them for over a decade now. So I'm thrilled to be able to share some of what I've learned. What you might find interesting before we jump into this even deeper is that when I was a child, I actually hated religion. I grew up in a small town in South Central Illinois, and religion, quite frankly, felt like a curse to me. I was forced to attend church every Sunday morning, every Sunday night, every Wednesday night. And to make matters worse, here's a great picture for you. I had to wear my, quote, church clothes every Sunday. So it was a very legalistic kind of church environment. It really meant nothing to me at the time. Nothing at all. In fact, it felt very imposed. It felt like an imposed religious identity, a burden that I had to carry. And perhaps some of you that are listening today had a similar background where you felt like you were required to participate in some form of religion that maybe you weren't excited about. According to Sharon Parks, who is someone who has written about faith development among young adults, many of our college students come to college with some form of imposed religious identity, or what she calls an inherited faith. So they come to us, they come into our residence halls, our apartment communities, with a wide variety of background experiences related to religion and spirituality. They bring that with them to college. That does not stay at the door of the residence hall. They bring it right with them. So what does this inherited faith look like? Well, we don't know all the details about it, but there's a large national study that was done close to a decade ago. So it's getting a little dated, but it's still the only study of its kind that really looked at characteristics of incoming college students concerning religion and spirituality. And there's a book, if you haven't read it, and if you're interested in this topic, I encourage you to read it. It's the Cultivating the Spirit book by researchers at UCLA. They shared some really interesting statistics about entering first-year college students that really opened up a lot of people's eyes to, hey, this is important. This is an important topic for us to be considering. And I'm going to share some of those statistics with you because I think you'll find those interesting. And again, this is for incoming first-year college students. 80% attended religious services during the year prior to coming to college. And 80% said when they started college that they had an interest in spirituality. More than 77% believe in God, and almost 70% said they pray. Those are large numbers. And I think that's why some people were really quite surprised when they saw these statistics. Something else that they found is that more than 2 out of 3 of these entering college students said that their religious beliefs provided them with strength, support, and guidance. 3/4 of them said that they felt a sense of connection with God or a higher power that transcended their own personal self. And this is perhaps what's most relevant to those of you working in housing and to all of us in higher education. Nearly 50% say that it's essential, or at least very important, that we who work in higher education encourage students' personal expressions of spirituality. So this research was really groundbreaking in saying, hey, this is an area we need to really look at, because students are coming to college expecting that we will. They expect that it's part of what we're going to be doing in our jobs. And for those of you who've gone through graduate programs in student affairs, you might recall reading some of the earlier documents in student affairs, the student personnel point of view, for instance, that actually suggested that this is an aspect of holistic development that we need to concern ourselves with. So in particular, there's a statement that says higher education should include attention to the student's well-rounded development, physically, socially, emotionally, and spiritually, as well as intellectually. Now, at this point, you might be saying, yeah, but Christy, what about the separation of church and state? For those of us who work at public colleges and universities, we aren't really supposed to be talking about these things, are we? And I think, I bring that up because that's a question that I get asked, I would say 90% of the time that I give a presentation about spirituality and religion in higher education. So let's talk about that briefly before we move on. And keeping in mind that the rules are different for private higher education, let me talk a little bit about First Amendment and what it says about what it shows us concerning religion in the halls, in the residence halls. There are 2 clauses in the First Amendment that actually focus directly on religious expression. One of them is the Establishment Clause, and the other is the Free Exercise Clause. According to the Establishment Clause, public higher education cannot support one religion over another. We can't prioritize one over another. We have to do our best to remain neutral to all religious perspectives on campus. The second provision is the Free Exercise Clause, which means that we should allow students, faculty, staff, the right to freely express their religion without suppressing that. That means that, and the challenge in here is, how do we do that? How do we allow people on campus to freely express their religion without coming across as promoting one over another? And those are some of the questions that come up regularly when people ask about this, and people tend to think, that just means we need to keep hands off of religion. And that's not really true. The phrase separation of church and state, first of all, is not even in the Constitution. It was actually written in a letter. And the original meaning of that phrase was that the government should stay out of the church's business, not vice versa. So we've really kind of misinterpreted that over the years. So the reality is that it's just not true that we need to keep our hands off of religion in public universities. The reality is, in terms of housing, and that's obviously what I'm focusing on this morning, residents are allowed, your residents in your residence halls, your apartment communities, they are allowed to appropriately express their religious and spiritual identities. Well, the question might be, what would that look like? How do they appropriately do that? One common way that you see that many people have expressed their religion in residence halls and apartment communities is just through decorations in the rooms in their apartments. This is one example that a colleague provided to me. And legally, this is something that needs to be allowed unless those decorations violate any type of safety policies. And so it's not uncommon to see religious paraphernalia in people's rooms, and that's an appropriate form of religious expression. Other ways that people express their religion is holding religious meetings or activities in their own rooms or their own apartments, or sometimes even in the lounges and lobbies of residence halls and apartment communities. Some of these things can be challenging because for instance, if one roommate wants to hold a religious activity in a residence hall room and the other roommate does not, then the question becomes, how do we respond to that? Those are some of the challenges. If someone wants to use candles in their room as part of a religious practice, how do we make reasonable accommodations for that? That's a question as well. And then when it comes to lounges and lobbies, a lot of people would say, boy, it makes a lot of people uncomfortable if there's a religious activity going on in our residence hall lounge. So how do we respond to that? Let me just add some. I'll dig in here a little bit deeper, but then if there's more questions, we can talk about that later. The most important thing to remember when it comes to like lounges and lobbies in terms of religious expression is that you can restrict activities as long as you're not restricting it based on the fact that it's a religious event. So in other words, we talk about time, place, and manner restrictions when it comes to things like this. Time would be, an example of that would be, we only allow people to use our lounges and our lobbies when it's not quiet hours. So again, you're not restricting based on the fact that it's a religious activity. You're restricting the time frame in which a lounge or a lobby could be used. In terms of place, it might be that you say, this particular room in our hall is a study space. It's not meant to be a group space. And so you could keep, you could prevent or restrict groups from having religious activities in a space like that. And the term manner, when it comes to these kinds of things, an example of that, it talks about how it's done. And so one common example is using amplified sound, using a microphone, those kinds of things. Someone in housing could say, there's a certain space in our hall where we don't want sound, or we don't want musical instruments, or whatever might be used in some kind of a religious activity. So there are a lot of other nuanced issues related to religious expression from a legal perspective, but I think that's kind of just an introduction for folks here. What I like to encourage people to do is that when there are challenges, when, for instance, if roommates are upset or if other people are upset about someone expressing their religion, assuming the person's appropriately expressing their religion, I encourage people to think about fighting speech with speech rather than silencing speech. What I mean by that is rather than telling people you can't express your religion if they're doing it appropriately, encouraging people who don't agree with it to express their viewpoints in some way, shape, or form, so that everyone has the opportunity to talk and to express and to be who they are without silencing others. I think that's the safest way legally, and I think that's the best way ethically. And that also creates environments where people can talk about different viewpoints. That's really, really good. So on another note here, we don't have time to go into this in the formal presentation, but maybe in the Q&A, a lot of questions come to me about whether or not the staff, the RAs, or the professional staff, can they express their religious identities in the workplace? And that's a whole different topic. If we get to that in the Q&A, that's great. If not, feel free to contact me later down the road, and I'm happy to talk about that as well. Okay, so what we've talked about so far are incoming freshmen, kind of how they come in with an inherited faith. We've talked a little bit about, hey, it's okay legally to talk about these things. I want to move on and talk about what happens when students get here. How does their faith or their religious or spiritual practices change during college? And so I'm going to share a little bit of some research on that. First concept I'm going to share with you is one that researchers have called spiritual quest. What those UCLA researchers found in their study was that about 75% of all college students said that they were seeking meaning and purpose in life while they were in college. And those researchers at UCLA said that the spiritual quest process is at the core of spiritual development. And Sharon Parks, who I mentioned earlier, said, part of what is involved in this spiritual quest process, though she didn't use the term spiritual quest, is answering big questions like the ones I have on the screen. So Sharon Parks would say, it's important for our students to be asking themselves these questions. Why should I get out of bed in the morning? What's the purpose of my existence and the existence of others? What can I depend upon? Am I ultimately alone? What's the ultimate character of the cosmos in which I dwell? Those are very existential questions that might even scare those of you who are listening right now. So I say all that to say that a number of college students come in to college, move into your residence halls and your apartment communities, and start asking themselves these kinds of questions. And those are big questions that we need to attend to. There are other students, and maybe some of the same, who, when they get to college, actually go through a religious struggle of some sort. They feel real unsettled about spiritual and religious matters. They feel disillusioned with the way they were raised. They struggle to understand evil, suffering, and death. Why do, in other words, the common question, why do bad things happen to good people kind of thing? They feel angry with God. This religious struggle that a lot of college students face often leads to change for them as well. And in fact, religious struggle is described as sometimes being like a shipwreck experience for college students. All of a sudden, it's like a shipwreck. It's challenging. They don't know what to do. They've been raised one way to believe one thing, and now they're trying to figure out what they believe on their own. So very common that among college students. And when I started at Bradley University, I had a misconception about Christianity due to the way that I was raised. And so I would say, to a certain extent, I experienced a religious struggle as well, very similar to what's described in this. I had been raised in a very legalistic Christian home. I got to college. I met other people who identified as Christians but practiced it differently, not in a legalistic way, and they were happy about it and joyful about it. And so I experienced this religious struggle and tried to figure out, what do I believe? What do I believe as a result of this? So many other college students do that as well. In terms of other changes in religious and spiritual identities, research shows that during college, many students become more spiritual and that they become more caring, more tolerant, more connected with others. At the same time, the research shows, and again, this is the UCLA study, that many become less religiously engaged, which means they stop attending religious services or reading religious texts, even though they would say that they're still religiously committed. So what that means is a college student might say, you know what, I'm a Catholic. I'm a Catholic. I was raised Catholic. I'm still a Catholic, but that college student might not attend Mass anymore, like she did when she was in high school. So she's religiously committed, but not religiously engaged. And so that's what some of the research is showing about college students as well. But for those students who do remain religiously engaged, some of them become very religiously engaged. For anyone out there who might have spent any time at K-State, here where I work, Thursday nights are a big night for campus ministry groups on our campus. This is a picture of one of the largest ones, Christian Challenge. And these are highly religiously engaged students, highly religiously engaged. And in fact, evangelical Christian groups on campus are growing by leaps and bounds. There are some of the fastest growing student groups in higher education. A couple of them here on our campus have about 400 to 500 student attendees each week. So it's to a point where, and they mostly meet on Thursday nights. And so our housing staff, they know it's not a good idea to plan a program on a Thursday night because of how many residents are religiously engaged on our campus. Sharon Parks, who I mentioned earlier, talks about the importance of mentoring communities where faith development is concerned. And for many of those students, those campus religious groups serve as their primary mentoring community during college. And it has a very powerful influence on them. So let me take a closer look at some of the ways that college students embrace and experience their religious identities in college. And some of this research has come from an article by Bowman and colleagues in 2014. I could get that reference to you at some point down the road if you'd like to ask. So let me give you an overview of some of what it looks like among our college students. Muslim students, a national study of Muslim students or of college students found that only about 1% of all college students identify as Muslim, meaning that there are almost 200,000 Muslim students in the US. According to the research, on average, Muslim students are very religious and are committed to sharing their faith, whereas they have little religious skepticism or struggle. Unfortunately, several studies, not just the one I've listed on the screen, several studies have found that many Muslim students experience marginalization and discrimination, especially many Muslim women who veil. And so that's something that we need to really attend to. Buddhist students constitute about 0.9% of the college student population. Unfortunately, very little is known about Buddhist college students. In general, though, the research shows that they have a strong interest in spiritual questions and understanding other religions. They're not very religiously engaged or committed. In fact, only 6% report that they pray daily, and they do display a lot of religious skepticism. So that's what we know from the research about college students who identify as Buddhist. Hindus constitute about 0.7% of all college students. They, according to the research, they would rate above average in terms of their charitable involvement, their ethic of care, and having an ecumenical worldview, which are all indicators of spirituality. So these students would be viewed as highly spiritual students. Hindu students would be. Jewish students constitute about 2% of all college students. Upon entering college, they're less religiously committed and less religiously and spiritually engaged than other students as a whole, according to the research. They also become increasingly skeptical of religion while attending college, which is just an interesting research-based finding, I think. Some Jewish students frame their Judaism as both a religion and an ethnicity, so those who identify as Jewish can exhibit a wide range of Jewish practices and beliefs, or non-belief in God. Some Jewish practices are quite common, like lighting Hanukkah candles, whereas others are a little less common, like engaging in kosher eating habits. Not much research has been conducted about Native American students, but there is one article that came out in the Journal of College and University Student Housing in the 2014 issue of it. And in it, the author wrote about a spiritual and religious practice of many Native American students. It's called smudging, or a blessing ceremony. It's often held at the beginning of a semester to help Native American students have a clear mind and feel protected from negative forces on campus. What happens is an elder conducts the ceremony, and it involves the use of an eagle feather or fan and the burning of cedar, sage, or sweetgrass. As the cedar, sage, or sweetgrass is burning, the elder prays for the person, the organization, or the place, and each person can be blessed and prayed over. So if you're interested in this practice, I encourage you to look at that article. It's in the Journal of College and University Student Housing, and it provides a real interesting glimpse into Native American spirituality. Evangelical Christian students have received a significant amount of research as a subset of all Christian students, probably mostly because they're very religiously engaged, as I mentioned earlier. Some of the research, however, has reported that this group of students frequently feels outvoiced and misunderstood, and they feel sometimes like a marginalized minority. So it's an interesting dynamic that a lot of these students are reporting. Non-religious students encompass a lot of different belief systems, and there's no way I can touch on all of them, but they do include atheist students, agnostic students, and those who identify as free thinkers or as spiritual but not religious. And there are currently close to 400 student groups affiliated with the Secular Student Alliance, which is one of the more common student organizations for non-religious students. There's an article in that same issue of the Journal of College and University Student Housing, 2014 issue, about non-religious students. And in it, the authors discussed, what they call deconversion. A process that a lot of these students go through is called deconversion. And they describe it as intellectual, experiential, emotional, and moral disengagement from a religion. So they get deconverted, essentially. They also talked about the challenges that some of these students face in their own, what they called, coming out process as non-religious students. Some reported that they're teased and mocked. Others reported that when they came out as being non-religious, that religious students became scared of them. So just some interesting insights from the research about students. I'm going to move on to some real direct challenges and opportunities that people in housing and people in higher ed in general have related to religion and spirituality on campus. Some of these include controversial campus speakers, overly aggressive religious organizations, and others. But let's start with the issue of Christian privilege as a challenge. I'll give you a second to look at this cartoon. It looks like someone who represents Christianity is standing at the club door, and says, "Oh, snap, I forgot to put your names on the list." And those who represent other religions are left outside. And that's basically the premise of Christian privilege, only very simplified. The idea behind Christian privilege, as written in our field, is that those who are Christian have certain privileges that others do not, such as expecting to have time off work or school to celebrate religious holidays. They're able to worship freely without fear of violence or threats. I might add that that's not true in other countries, but that certainly is a privilege of Christians in our country. Positive references to their faith are seen dozens of times a day, and there are a lot of other reflections of Christian privilege that people talk about. Well, this is a challenge. This is a challenge in higher ed for a variety of reasons. One, it's a challenge to people who aren't Christians, as is reflected in this comic, the picture that's on the screen. It's also a challenge to people who are Christians in terms of how to respond to that. Let me give you an example of this. This bulletin board was put up in a residence hall at a public university a while back, several years ago, and it's called Unpacking Christian Privilege. On the bulletin board, we can't really read it from here, but there's little white pieces of rectangular paper, and on each one of those pieces of paper is a description of what Christian privilege entails, similar to what I have already discussed. So an RA put this bulletin board up in a residence hall, and within a few days, someone vandalized it. I believe that person wrote "F this" across the bulletin board. So take a minute and just think, what would you do as a housing staff member? How would you respond to that? Well, let me tell you how they responded. The RA put an identical bulletin board back up, replaced it, and added this sign to it. And I'll take a minute and read it. It says, "This is an educational board. It's meant for everyone to understand institutionalized privilege. Understanding what other groups go through in this culture is not an attack on Christians, but rather to educate everyone. The word privilege refers to a term that exists in this world and is nothing to be ashamed of, rather to give a perspective of everyone's non-Christian neighbor. Vandalism is never an appropriate way to express personal views. RAs will be available to discuss any concerns. We encourage everyone to read the entirety of the board's content before creating any negative views." So clearly, this issue of Christian privilege is a challenge in our residence halls. How do we do this? How do we educate about Christian privilege without making Christians feel marginalized or shamed? And I don't know who, it was never found, to my knowledge, it was never determined who had actually vandalized the board. So I'm in no way, shape, or form assuming that a Christian did, because that might not be the case. But I will say that this issue of Christian privilege is challenging for Christians. And how do we deal with this? I'm going to go back to what I mentioned earlier as one simplistic response, and that's fighting speech with speech rather than silencing speech. So if I was a staff member in that residence hall, I might consider creating an additional bulletin board for people to express their opinions in response to the bulletin board that I created. Get a dialogue going on bulletin boards, asking for appropriate language and things like that. So that's one challenge that folks in housing and in all of higher education is trying to figure out how to deal with, the issue of Christian privilege. Another challenge with regard to religion and spirituality in higher education pertains to the intersection of religious identity and sexual identities, and sometimes not the intersection, sometimes just religious identity versus sexual identity. That takes on many different forms, but there have been a number of research articles and master's reports and dissertations that have really looked at these two social identities and how they come together and how they conflict at times. And I'm guessing that those of you who are listening today have had some challenges with students, with staff surrounding these issues. I know you're hoping for the $1 million answer to the challenges. I can't provide that. I wish I could. I wish I had the answer to these challenges. But I do have a couple of thoughts to consider as we talk about this. First of all, I would say that I believe, and this is a tweet that I tweeted several years ago, and that I think relates directly to this. I believe that these issues have underlying religious and spiritual beliefs associated with them about what's right, what's wrong, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, nature versus nurture. There are worldview differences regarding some of these things. And so what I encourage people to do is to think about the fact that it's possible to disagree with the religious and spiritual beliefs of others without denigrating others. So in the challenges with religion and spirituality, how can we disagree with different perspectives, different worldviews on these issues without denigrating others? That's really what I think we need to work towards. Some people really say, let's not talk about agreeing to disagree, that kind of thing. Well, the reality is sometimes that's our only option, is to disagree and to do so respectfully. And I think when it comes to religion and spirituality, how can we help our residents? How can we help our staff really try to unpack what's underneath their beliefs about these issues, and then figure out how to be respectful of each other in spite of those beliefs. Another challenge that we face on our campuses, and I know sometimes residence halls have some religious organizations and speakers that are up close and personal to the buildings and get real close and try to talk to students on the way in the residence halls and out. And this one's an example of one who looks like a Christian group potentially, but it's not always Christian groups. And a lot of Christian groups are not aggressive in the way that I'm describing here. But there are some challenges on campuses with, how do we deal with this? It seems like these certain groups are being too aggressive, or the speakers are speaking things that are just, oh my goodness, they're hateful. How do we respond to this? And I would say my first few things to keep in mind here when it comes to these issues, when you think about working around your residence hall and apartment community, students who are in these organizations do have the right to try to convince people to believe the way they do. The First Amendment provides the right to freely try to persuade other people to believe different things about politics, religion, what restaurant's best, whatever you want to say. The right to try to persuade others is guaranteed by the First Amendment. So they do have the right to be organizing and trying to encourage people to believe a certain way. That said, we must teach students appropriate ways to express their religion. So key things here are no harassment. We don't want student organizations or religious speakers harassing certain individuals. We don't want deception. We don't want people tricking people into trying to come be a part of their religious group. None of that is appropriate, in my opinion, and those are the types of things that we need to really work with our students to understand. And we need to help our students and our staff understand a lot of these legal parameters, like I've just been talking about. Help them understand, here's what's legal, here's what's appropriate, but also think about, how is this affecting other people? How can you do this appropriately? Those types of things we need to really be thinking about. One thing that's been kind of stirring in my heart and my mind over the last several years when I think about aggressive religious organizations and speakers is, I think if we're secure in our identity, our own identity and our own beliefs, it'd be harder to be offended by other people's contradictory beliefs. So what I mean by that is, maybe part of the way to address this issue is to help our students gain security in their own religious and spiritual or non-religious identity, so that when other people are trying to convince them that, hey, maybe your belief, if they're trying to tell them their beliefs are wrong or what have you, if they're secure in what they believe, I can't imagine that it would be quite as offensive to them. So just my 2 cents tossed out there. Happy to entertain questions or comments about that at the end here. One other thing that has become very clear, especially here on my campus, is we need to teach students to be kind yet assertive when they're not interested in any kind of religious dialogue. We find that our students try to be kind and they don't want to upset people. And so if there are aggressive religious organizations that are trying to get them involved, they don't know how to say no. They don't want it, or they don't want to say no. And so we've been trying to work with our students to say, just say, I'm not interested. I appreciate what you're trying to do, but I'm not interested. Please stop contacting me. Or, I really don't want to talk about religion anymore, so I'm going to ask that we not do that. So how do we teach our students to step up and say, I'm not interested. I'm not interested in this. please don't continue to share with me about that. Another topic that is challenging in housing in all of higher ed, I guess, but I've seen and heard about it a lot in housing since I've interacted in that sphere quite a bit, relates to hiring and accommodating religious and non-religious students and staff. I think, a little personal story here, I can remember when I was sitting in the residence life office interviewing for my job as an assistant RA, which is the first step in the process where I was. I don't remember a whole lot about the interview, but I do remember that there was a comment made by one of the interviewees, and she said, "We'd like to offer you a job, but we need to make it clear that you're not allowed to use this position to proselytize." And the truth was, I had not even thought about that idea. That idea had not even entered my head. I honestly, like a lot of RAs, really needed the job to provide room and board so that I could stay at the university. That was why I needed the job. I wish I could say I wanted it so I could help develop students and help them be academically successful. That sounds great, but that's not why I wanted the job. I needed it to be able to stay at school. All that to say, during the course of the interview, I had never mentioned my faith, my religious identity, none of that. Hadn't discussed it at all, hadn't worn any religious clothing, hadn't brought any religious artifacts with me. If I remember correctly, I simply had listed InterVarsity Christian Fellowship in the section of my resume pertaining to my campus involvement. That's all. Now, this isn't an example of discrimination. I was not discriminated against, but it did get my attention. And it birthed within me a desire to understand more about the legalities of religious expression. And we know this. We know we can't discriminate in our hiring based on religion. But here's the challenge that I've heard that we face oftentimes, is that we sometimes want to make a hiring decision based on what we think the other person's going to do, or our perceptions of their motives. So I've heard things like, "Oh, I don't know that we should hire so-and-so because they're actively involved in such and such a religious group, so they're probably just trying to use this position to recruit people to their group." If we make those kinds of judgments, that could become discriminatory because we have no basis for, unless we have evidence for that kind of thing, that can be really problematic. One thing that's important in terms of hiring and accommodating religious staff and students is making sure that we make their employment expectations clear. So if you're concerned, we've got a lot of staff who want off on Sundays to celebrate their religion, part of the employment expectation might be, I expect you're going to be on call one Sunday a month, or you're going to need to, make that expectation clear prior to hiring them. We need to do our best to provide reasonable accommodations for students and staff to celebrate their religious faith and spiritual identities and non-religious identities. But we can ask them to request accommodations in advance. It's certainly very appropriate for them to do, for us to ask for. So those are some things that, some challenges that we face in housing that I think are worth considering. Let's talk briefly about some recommendations for practice, and one more section after that. We'll wrap things up here and we'll open it up for some questions. Over a decade ago, Robert Nash, who was, I don't think he is anymore, a professor of education, said this. He said, "Religious pluralism, if left unattended, is a phenomenon that in the future will threaten to divide students, faculty, and administrators in a way that makes all the other campus divisions look tame by comparison." I think that's still true, perhaps even more so today. So what do? Here are some practical ideas first. Ask your staff to read journal articles about these things. Never stop learning and growing. And I mentioned the 2014 issue of the Journal of College and University Student Housing. It's the themed issue on religion and spirituality. There's some really good topics I've pulled from some of this part of this presentation from those. So learn more as a staff about these issues. Create journaling groups among your staff and your students about topics related to religion and spirituality. Maybe pull out some of those big questions that Sharon Parks thinks we need to talk about. What's the meaning of life, and why is there suffering in the world? And engage students in journaling and thinking about these things. Some more practical ideas that only involve a table to sit around, okay? Host a session with campus ministers and other religious workers to build relationships and discuss collaboration and figure out how to best serve students together. Sit around a table and have an interfaith forum on spirituality and religious diversity. Invite people who represent different worldviews and viewpoints to share their thoughts on different campus issues based on their perspective, their worldview. Have big questions discussions in groups like this. But I want to go a bit deeper in challenging all of us in terms of considering ways to help students and staff concerning religion and spirituality and housing. Here, and I'm going to start with this. Robert Nash, I mentioned him earlier, just a few minutes ago, is concerned, and I'm concerned too, that many students are silent about religion and spirituality for the wrong reasons. He said, students learn to be silent when their talk about spiritual matters is met with awkward hesitation, disregard, or even disdain. Many times I think students just perceive us as simply being unwilling to listen. We're just not willing to listen. They want to talk about these issues, faith, religion, spirituality, and they perceive us, whether it's true or not, they perceive us as not being willing to listen to them for whatever reason. And so I believe what we most need are professionals like those of you listening who are willing to demonstrate and teach some key principles for religious dialogue about these kinds of things. And here's the first principle I'm going to propose. And that's the principle of refusing to accuse people in conversation. Anytime religion and spirituality, and politics too, for that matter, but anytime religion and spirituality comes to the surface, what I've seen and heard and observed are accusations that come quickly before we have the opportunity to really hear what people think and believe on various issues. And here's let me give you some examples. Language is powerful. I can't tell you how many times I've heard someone being called either too religious or overly religious. That's an accusation, and that's not necessarily a positive one, you know? I'm not sure how that facilitates productive dialogue. I've heard people use the phrase so-and-so or these groups of people have no moral compass. That's a destructive accusation. I've heard people say they're being persecuted for their religion. That's a strong word. That's a strong word. And it's not that I think there is religious persecution in various parts of the world, but I think tossing that out right away just adds fuel to the fire, and it makes it really challenging for us to have good conversations when our first or close to first reactions are accusations. Let me take a minute and look at this little comic. I think this is one that people have tended to kind of like shake their heads and say, yeah, I see this. In this comic, the man with the green shirt says to the man in the yellow shirt, "You uninformed, moronic, hate-mongering, insane bigot. You're totally unwilling to accept the truth and see things from a viewpoint other than your own ignorant, stupid, uncompromising position." And then the same man in the green shirt says, "And you need to be more tolerant of other people's views." His sign says, "You're wrong, I'm right." The other guy's sign says, "I'm right, you're wrong." It's one of those, it represents how quick we are to call people intolerant. And that's an accusation that I think has probably caused more harm than good on our campuses, is when we just label someone as intolerant. I was really struck by an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education back in 2015, and here's a portion of it that I wanted to share. The author says, "You can think a religious belief is wrong without being intolerant. Tolerance is not synonymous with believing someone else is right." So my recommendation is to be very careful about using the accusation of intolerance, and let's help our students understand the destructive power of that word, and that just because someone disagrees with someone does not necessarily mean they're intolerant. I think those are some things to consider. Tim Keller is actually someone who identifies as a Christian, so of course I've drawn from some of his work as well. He says, every religion or non-religion, even those that appear more inclusive, make exclusive claims. So I say all that to say that really, if we think about it, we're probably could all be classified as intolerant because we believe what we believe because we think it's right. And if we think it's right, what we believe, then people who have a different belief than us, we would naturally would think they're wrong. And so, I mean, I think that's just life. That's how we are. And so using the accusation of intolerance, I think just makes matters worse. I'm going to go quickly here because I've spent more time talking than I thought I would. I do encourage us to confront assumptions with people. Oftentimes, we think that if a person is a part of a group that's caused problems in the past, then they too will cause problems. Augustine says we're never to judge a philosophy by its abuse. I think that's fantastic. I think we in higher ed are quick to assume that students or faculty or staff are going to act a certain way just because of their religious label. And we don't give them the chance to demonstrate to us who they are and how they're going to act. So my suggestion is that the only assumption we make is that we assume the best about other people, and that would change a lot. I also encourage us to communicate with each other with humility instead of anger. We tend to just get angry when people disagree with us. Is there a way for us to slow down? A principle within my faith is this: be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to become angry or offended. I think it's a great principle. I think it becoming great in terms of, it would be very useful when we talk about religion and spirituality. And finally, I encourage us to mentor with authenticity. I've occasionally mentioned some of my personal story in this because I've been told that when students with any type of social identity, when they hear from professionals who've kind of few years ahead of them about their story, it helps them to open up and be authentic as well. So I encourage you all to not be afraid to talk about your own religious and spiritual journeys. Be willing to be authentic, be willing to be vulnerable, because I think that helps in this process as well. Patsy Claremont said, authenticity is the cutting edge that adds relevancy to what we say, and I believe it's true. So as hidden educators, Robert Nash says that every student affairs professional is a hidden educator. I encourage us to think about these things and to teach our students about these things in terms of religion and spirituality. I believe wholeheartedly that campus life is enriched when we talk openly and respectfully about religion and spirituality on campus. So let's encourage that. Let's encourage that to be done appropriately. Thanks for inviting me to the webinar. I'm going to go ahead and put my information here on the screen, and then I'll open it up for questions.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Kraft, for presenting all that. I'm seeing a few things coming up. If there are groups or organizations in our campus or local communities that have shown to be harmful to various identities, what responsibility do you see those members as having to do the work in showing they're open? Should it be on the religious minority to assume good intentions?
Okay, that's good. That's a good question. I'm going to try to, there's no way I can talk about all of it, but let me tackle it on the at least surface. Part of it is we have to talk about what we mean by harmful, because I think one of the biggest controversies right now is having a belief in and of itself harmful, or is acting harmfully harmful. And that might sound, I mean, that's really challenging but there's a separation here. So what I mean by that is this: on a university campus, we have codes of conduct, we have those various principles of community, we have things like that. If there's any form of religious or non-religious or spiritual group that is violating codes of conduct, that needs to be reported to the Student Life Office, period, plain and simple. No one should be suffering harmful, threatening behavior from any other person on campus. That, I think, is easier to deal with than the issue of, and I'm just going to frame it this way: someone holds a belief that's opposed to mine, and because that belief is opposed to mine, then I automatically feel marginalized or harmed by it. Those are harder issues to get to, because then if there's no actions associated with that, a university can't take disciplinary action, if that makes sense. So part of what we have to, the challenge we have is, where do we draw, what do we deem as harmful? The belief itself or the action that stems from the belief? And at this point where we are in higher ed, actions, the behaviors and the actions, or the speech, it could be speech if it's threatening or harassing, if it falls under one of the unprotected categories, those things can be restricted, but the belief itself cannot, and that makes it challenging.
All right, I'm waiting to see. There's a little bit of the time between what we're talking about here and as it shows up. So I'll wait just a few seconds to see if we have any other questions here. Tiffany Firestone, who's our communications director and works at Washington State University, asked that question, and she says, "Thank you for answering that."
Sure.
All right. Well, Dr. Kraft, did you have any last-minute thoughts or anything that you want to express?
No, I just appreciate the fact that your association is talking about this issue. I think it's very, as you know from the research, it's very, very important. And I appreciate the invitation to come. I'm excited about this topic. I hope you could hear that in my voice. And so I invite anyone who wants to continue the conversation with me to do so. I'm a work in progress myself. Some of these ideas are budding ideas in my own mind. I'm trying to continue to move toward how do we handle these things well. And so I'm open to dialogue about this, and I invite anyone to do that, to contact me.
Thank you again so much for presenting. We are very grateful for having you present to our region, even though I know it's lunchtime for you. And so giving up your lunch today, thank you. But since I don't see any other questions, I am going to put the little survey response in the chat here on YouTube. So if you have anything, feedback you want to give, or contact Dr. Kraft at all, I can pass that along for everyone. But at this time, we're going to go ahead and wrap up. We do have a webinar next Friday, May 3rd, and that'll be our May 1st Friday webinar. But thanks for everyone joining. Hopefully see you next week.